Hey, it's Coach Taylor here from SmarterTeamTraining.com. I am certain that everybody that gets a chance to listen to this episode has had the opportunity to meet somebody, work with somebody, or get a chance to discuss the concepts of diabetes. And I know it's a little off the path of the conversations I typically have on this show, but having an opportunity to discuss this topic on this platform, I think is very important, because if we can help others achieve their own greatness through this illness or disease, depending on what you want to call it, I think is very important. And I think it's a conversation you need to have with your athletes, your coaches, and even potentially the family members or the people you work with if it comes up. And you got to be comfortable having conversations about it. And so I actually had a chance to read some books from Human Kinetics by Dr. Sheri Colberg, and she was, I think, awesome. And get a chance to shoot her an email, and she said she'd gladly get on the show with me. And we just went back and forth a couple times, and to have her on the phone now is awesome. So, Sheri, I appreciate you taking some time out of your day. I look forward to just talking some shop here about diabetes and hopefully the positive things that we can be doing to really help people live a better life, a healthier life, and just getting a chance to learn from you.
Great. That sounds fun. I'm happy to get started. Let's go.
Sheri, before we get started here, could you do me a favor? Can you tell me a little bit about how you got involved in the field, a little bit about your passion for what you became, an expert in, if you don't mind me calling you that, and really, how did diabetes really pop up on your radar?
It's kind of an interesting story. It's from two sides. As you know, there are two main types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2, and we generally, the names have changed several times even since I've been in the field, but generally we think about type 2 hitting older people who are less active and maybe eat too much or maybe gain a little extra weight and so forth. So it's thought of more of being like a disease where insulin doesn't work as well anymore, or they become resistant to it, and insulin is the main thing that allows us to take carbohydrate up into muscles and use it effectively. Whereas type 1 is thought of as more of an autoimmune disease, meaning that it started because something triggered the body thinking that the cells that make cells that make insulin in the pancreas were not part of the body, and then they get destroyed. So there are still a lot of theories about what triggers that, and no one knows for sure, but it does seem to have some sort of an environmental trigger. And that was actually thought of as being more of a juvenile disease that only hit kids. But I'll have to say in my personal experience that half the people I've met developed type 1 diabetes as adults. So don't think that it's not something that couldn't happen to anybody. And many of those people were very athletic. So where I kind of got into this field was, well, first from working with my grandmother who had type 2, only they didn't diagnose it back then. They called her borderline. And when I was about 12 or 13, I spent a couple of weeks with her one summer, and she was on yet another diet. And I said, I'll help you. And so I was weighing her in on her scale and helping her measure out her cottage cheese and having her running laps around the backyard. So these are all things that I just thought of, on my own. And she paid me $1 for every pound that she lost during the first week. Now, I know in retrospect that first week it's a lot easier to lose the pounds than it is maybe, 3 or 4 weeks into a diet, but she lost 8 pounds in 1 week, and I was one rich kid, so it was like my foray into the field. But I also have a personal connection with diabetes that stems from my having had type 1 since I was 4 years old, and I've always found that exercise has just been such an important part of managing my own diabetes, feeling more in control of it, just feeling better physically and emotionally, dealing with the condition for so many years. So that's kind of a short bio about how I got into it. And I became an exercise physiologist because of my interest in why that made me feel so much better. And I just have sort of applied that to diabetes and also to lifestyle management. So I actually cover both type 1 and type 2 diabetes.
Oftentimes, if you're talking about the concept of diabetes, people jump right into the concept of, well, your nutrition must be off, and you got to monitor blood sugar and these types of almost negative things. I mean, what kind of impact is diabetes having on the nutritional approach, even prior to training and practices for athletes, or how should we be managing those individuals after practices, on bus rides, before strength, high anaerobic or aerobic exercises? Are there some different ways that we can really enhance the energy potential, we'll call it, for the athletes who are dealing with diabetes?
Absolutely. I think nutrition is a critical part of performing optimally. There is really no way that you can not manage your nutrition and do well in sports with either type of diabetes. The main reason is that the carbohydrates in muscle are one of the primary fuels that we use during any activity, the glycogen. And we can't store glycogen effectively when our insulin isn't working or it's absent, depending on the type of diabetes. And so it's really important to make sure that we do things that either make sure we have enough insulin or that the insulin that we have is working more effectively to help with carbohydrate storage and replacement in muscle after we work out and also in the liver. And there are many different approaches to that. And there isn't probably one. I wish I had the answer. I could just say, here's exactly what you do, but it's a little more complicated than that because the disease is a bit more complicated than that. What I usually advise people, though, is that when they're getting ready to go into an exercise, regardless of what type of diabetes they have, if they can maintain their blood glucose in a more normal range, which is anecdotally, the athletes have told me, is pretty much they start between 80 milligrams per deciliter and 180 milligrams per deciliter, so between 80 and 180, that they feel like they perform better than if they start lower than that or higher than that range. And so you kind of have to work with whether you're going to be having a meal right before, and if you have to give insulin, how do you take the right amount of insulin so that you end up right in that range when you're going to exercise? Or if you don't take insulin, what can you do to prevent big spikes in your glucose from what you eat? And it really does come down to picking the types of foods that fall into the right categories, that don't cause too much of a spike or may have a longer lasting effect on managing glucose over a couple of hours. Or one that may even prevent hypoglycemia or low blood glucose later on. And so I always have people learn a little bit more about carbs, protein, and fat, and how each of those are metabolized. So in general, carbohydrates become available starting within about 5 minutes of when you consume them. So if you get low blood glucose, you can take a glucose tablet or a goo gel or something, and you start to pop that glucose level right back up. And even in the carbs, when you have a mixed meal, they're usually absorbed within the first hour or two. So that's a good thing and it's a bad thing. It makes some glucose readily available, but can also spike your glucose too much. And then the proteins could take 3 to 4 hours to fully metabolize. Not all of the protein gets converted into glucose, depends on what else you're eating, but some of it does, and so it can help maintain glucose levels over a longer period of time. And then the fat is metabolized over a longer period of time. It takes all the way about 5 to 6 hours to be fully digested. And while that doesn't normally get directly converted into glucose either, it does make people more insulin resistant, so then the body uses the fat during recovery and kind of spares the glucose to go get back into storage and muscle and whatnot.
I've talked to several people about diabetes and how it relates to what I do as a strength and conditioning professional. I mean, does exercise benefit people who are diabetic? Is there a good or bad responses? If an individual is going to practice or doing some type of conditioning and then coming right to the weight room, is there something I need to pay attention to, or vice versa? If we're draining them pretty hard on the strength side of things, and then they're getting a chance to go out to practice or play or do that type of thing, or even go to class, are there some things that I can do around the exercise that I'm prescribing to really benefit the individual with diabetes?
Generally, athletes with diabetes need to fuel and refuel just like any other athlete. The trick is that for them, especially if they have type 1 and they have to inject or pump insulin, they have to make sure that they have the right amount of insulin to sort of balance their glucose out both during and after activities. So I wouldn't fuel a diabetic athlete any differently than I would fuel one without diabetes. It's just a matter of balancing out the insulin with the exercise and the timing of the food, and also the exercise, the effects of the exercise. Sometimes there's a residual effect where you will take up glucose more effectively for a period of time following the activity. So I would say just fuel the athlete as if the person didn't have diabetes, but then always keep an eye on how are they balancing out their blood glucose. For example, It's really interesting about I don't know when this chocolate milk craze started, like the ultimate recovery drink. I mean, if they'd asked me that as a person with type 1 diabetes years ago, I would have said, of course, that's a really great recovery drink. It's mainly because it does have a modest amount of carbohydrate, which you're trying to get a little bit in that window of opportunity right after you exercise. And it also has quite a bit of protein, and it has some fat. So it basically is a very balanced food, which doesn't spike the glucose too much right afterwards, yet it provides fuels and energy that can be used for glycogen recovery and glucose maintenance for a period of time afterwards. Or actually just even having a mixed meal will work too. But it is really critical. There have been a few studies that they've done in people with type 1 diabetes to look at their glycogen storage, and they've found that when they go on a higher carb diet, unless they're really on top of balancing the food with the insulin, they actually store less glycogen than if they're on a slightly lower carb diet, because just staying in a more normal range with glucose levels is really critical for everything sort of functioning more like normal.
I want to talk to you a little bit about the weight management scenario, and I work with some athletes that need to monitor their weight, whether it's for weigh-ins or even just because coaches are asking them to be lighter, so they're quote-unquote faster or that type of thing, or trying to decrease body fat, et cetera. I mean, what approach has worked for you with regards to working with athletes that are diabetic with regard to weight management issues?
I think the most critical thing is to avoid having a lot of hypoglycemia or low blood glucose. I remember having this athlete asked me one time, someone who was training heavily for, I think it was a Olympic racquetball team. I didn't know we had one, but apparently we do. And she said that she'd been training really hard and had been eating about the same as normal, but she was gaining weight. And so I asked her if she was having a lot of episodes of running low, and she said yes. I said, well, there you go. Those calories count too. I mean, even though you have to treat it, it's a medical condition, you have to treat hypoglycemia, those calories still add up. And most athletes I know that are training hard and gaining weight, that have diabetes, are gaining weight because they're having to eat extra to cover those lows. There's middle of the night lows, those after exercise lows, there's during exercise lows. So the real key is to realize that that's happening, and if they give insulin, finding the balance point, like how much do they need to cut back. Just for example, most athletes have told me that during a normal training season, their basal or their background insulin they have to cut that at least by a third of what it is if, say, they're off season or injured or not training like normal. So just the minimal insulin requirements go down, and then they also cut back on insulin that they take to cover meals and snacks and to treat even an elevation in the glucose levels. And it really is tricky, but what you have to do as an athlete with diabetes is just know your body and know your response to food and exercise better than the average person. You have to basically think like a pancreas.
Again, I'm going to stereotype any type of conversation that we have with the concept of diabetes as a whole, and it revolves around the concept of the glycemic index. I mean, does being aware of the glycemic index matter when talking about nutrition with diabetic people or athletes or just people in general?
I think that glycemic index is a critical thing to be aware of. It's not totally straightforward because the GI or the glycemic index of things can vary based on how you cook them and how long they sit and so forth. But on the whole, it's a pretty useful concept. For example, with athletes with diabetes, generally when they're exercising, they want to take in a higher GI type of carbohydrate. So the things that normal athletes use are fine for them to use. Usually, if it's to prevent a low or treat a low, it needs to be something that's absorbed rapidly. And blood glucose is glucose. It's the same as what you get in dextrose or the GU packets or in glucose gels and Smartie candies. And those sort of things. So I usually try to treat the lows that are associated with exercise with glucose. But in terms of preventing lows, you can use more like balance bars or power bars or something that actually has a balance of protein, carbohydrate, and fat, because of the reason I said before, where those are metabolized at different distances. So particularly if you're doing a longer distance event, you don't want to you could just take a glucose tablet every 10 minutes, and that may do it, but you can also try to take in something that's a little bit more balanced that may be digested more slowly over time to see if that would help balance out your glucose levels. So it's going to vary a lot by the sport and how long the sport is and the intensity of the sport, and also whether you're doing training or it's an actual game or competition, because you can have varying responses based off of that. But getting back to what I think about the GI in general, I think everybody should actually pay attention to that, because it appears that one of the best ways to prevent metabolic disorders, meaning, and diabetes being one of those, but where your metabolism just doesn't work as like it should, your insulin doesn't work right, or you may develop heart disease or something, is to eat foods that are absorbed more slowly, and basically ones that have a lot of fiber in them. And you can certainly get foods with added fiber nowadays, but just even picking the types of foods that have more fiber in them naturally, most of those have a lower glycemic index. And so they actually work so much better for the regular athlete who doesn't really need those glucose spikes either. There is something called reactive hypoglycemia, where some athletes, if they take in a large amount of glucose before they start to exercise, maybe 30 minutes to an hour, their body will put out a lot of insulin, and they can actually develop hypoglycemia while they're exercising just because there's still a lot of it around, a lot of insulin around. And that's in a non-diabetic athlete, so you have the same sort of problem with anybody, and I think that's a critical part for anybody who wants to perform well.
I want to talk to you about athletes as a whole, or again, just the environment of just being athletic or involved with being an active lifestyle. Generally speaking, I get a chance to have a little bit of impact on what the individuals are eating, either the day before, 2 days before type scenario, depending on the relationship that I have with the teams, especially at the college or pro level. I also have an opportunity to justify or try to encourage people to consume something right before the game or even at halftime, which is one thing that I think is kind of unique. When I was at Team Australia, they would actually hand out gummy worms and some type of almost like a hard candy type scenario, and it was also just to generate a little bit of sugar or sweetness, and it kind of caught me off guard because we don't do that a lot in America. We definitely aren't handing out gummy worms or Swedish fish during a practice or even at halftime, speaking generally. I mean, is there something that you could recommend potentially that we can use or actually consume either right before a game scenario when we're going out for warm-ups or even at halftime just to give us an edge? I think that time's a real crucial time where we can help replenish even a little bit of blood sugar, if you want to call it that, right before going out for, let's say, the third quarter or the second half. Is there a strategy that we should be considering with not only our diabetic athletes but also our healthy athletes?
I think when we get back to that whole idea of the GI again, you actually aren't going to want to eat a bowl full of beans right before you go out and do an activity, because although it's a nice low GI carb with lots of fiber and nutrients in it, it's just not going to be digested quickly enough to really be available during the activity. I still think that right before a game, right before the third quarter, right before you're going to do something, it's still better to take any type of a carbohydrate that has a higher GI, because really the reason that they are absorbed so quickly is that they're almost like partly pre-digested for us by the manufacturer. And they take whole wheat and they drip it down to white flour. They take out all the fiber and as well as 22 nutrients, but it still has the carbohydrate in there, and it can be absorbed very quickly, like bread is actually absorbed very quickly and causes spikes. But I think when you're thinking about quickly refueling between events or during an event, that type of approach is going to work better. Now, is there an optimal food? I'm not sure. I deal mostly with athletes with diabetes. They have their peculiar things they like to consume. I have a friend who's an ultra-distance runner who has type 1 diabetes, and she uses her training runs as opportunities to eat Pop-Tarts. She doesn't eat them normally otherwise, but they work for her during training runs. I've known people that will consume cake icing or glucose gels or the goo that all of those actually work pretty well when you just need a little bit of glucose to make sure that you don't drop during an event. You don't want to spike too high either, so it's kind of, you have to practice during practice to see how you're going to react and then figure out what would be the right amount and the right type of food. Sports drinks also have glucose polymers in them, so they're basically absorbed very quickly and absorbed as glucose.
I know you're making a big-time impact through your books, through the people you get a chance to connect with on a daily basis. I know you generally are going to have some type of either motivational message living with diabetes and getting a chance to work in that field. If it's somebody who is a coach or a player or a teammate, or even just somebody living with diabetes, is there some type of motivational message you have for them as far as them pursuing not only their athletic career but their academic career and just becoming a professional as a whole?
I think that the biggest thing I've learned over the years having to deal with type 1 diabetes myself is that it is possible to do whatever you want to do despite the fact that you have diabetes. It's sort of, annoying, but it's there. And things are so much easier now than they were back in the dark ages when I was actually diagnosed, when we didn't have blood glucose meters and we just tested urine, which would tell us we had sugar in our urine from 3 hours ago, but it didn't tell you really what you were at any particular moment in time. But there are so many different devices now, even just having a normal glucose monitor that you can use at home that allows you to check your glucose levels. Even during triathlons, people use these, and they'll check at the transition points. They'll have somebody run along with them and hold the glucose meter out so they can check their glucose and figure out where they are. And you can get a result in 5 seconds. It's just, to me, I'm just so grateful to have that ability to get that instantaneous feedback that you couldn't get anyway before. They also have some continuous monitoring devices that they work okay, not great during exercise, but I'm sure future generations of those will be able to give us even more instantaneous feedback, not just every time we want to poke a finger, but like every 5-minute readings. And, you can do trending and figure out where you're going up or down. I think a lot of that will help athletes really fine-tune. So I guess my motivational message from all that is live life first and be diabetic second. Don't let it hold you back. It's like you have it, but it shouldn't define you. I've known some athletes, professional athletes, that have developed type 1 diabetes. Just an example, Gary Hall Jr., the Olympic swimmer, who went through one Olympic Games without diabetes and then developed it and then went through 2 more Olympic Games with the diabetes, and he's now still followed around by like a guru for the fact that he has diabetes. And I think he'd rather just ignore that part altogether. But that you can't do that. I would say if you're going to go out there and give it your all, and then use yourself as a way to spread knowledge and share a message that it is possible to do everything with diabetes, and it's not going to keep you from participating in sports or being a world-class athlete. We have so many athletes now, just in the past decade, that have popped out of the woodworks that are professional football players and basketball players and cross-country skiers and long-distance runners and Olympic weightlifters. So it is possible. It just takes a little more dedication, and I think a lot of times those athletes with diabetes end up being better because of the diabetes, because they're very aware of how they should be fueling their body at any given time, and they're very aware of their body's responses and when they need to rest, and they listen to their bodies a lot better than the average athlete. So I don't see that necessarily as being an impediment at all. Embrace it. It'll make you a better athlete.
Well, Dr. Colberg, I appreciate you taking some time out of your day. I know you're very busy. I don't know how you find time to read as many books as you have on human kinetics. So when I went through that list, I was just very impressed to see that there was a lot of different opportunities for me to learn about diabetes from very different aspects, from an athletic type standpoint, from a youth standpoint, from just an active daily living type standpoint. I thought you did a great job covering a lot of different topics in the resources that you've provided. If anybody had any questions about reaching out to you as far as wanting to learn more about diabetes, maybe a conversation or question that they had or a direction they can go to find more information, how could they go about reaching out to you?
Well, I'm very easy to find online, but what I would suggest is going to my website directly, which is SheriColberg.com, SheriColberg.com. And on that, they can find a way to email me if they want to ask specific questions. I answer those all the time from athletes and parents and people all around the world. And on that, you'll also find a list of the 10 books I've written. I think for athletes with type 1 diabetes or coaches working with them, the most useful one I wrote is an update of my very first book, but it's called Diabetic Athlete's Handbook. And in that book, I go through some of the basic physiology of exercising with diabetes, what works, what doesn't work, what's a general approach to nutrition. And then I have over 100 different activities in there with real-life athlete examples. Every time I try to think of something I didn't cover, someone will go, well, how about curling? Oh, darn, yeah, I didn't get that one in there. But I have over 100 activities in there otherwise with examples and some explanation as why the body responds the way that it does. Because I didn't really get into it, but there is a big difference between a response to intense, heavy exercise compared to long, slow distance in terms of how the blood sugar responds. And if there are people who just generally want to gain more knowledge about exercise and diabetes and they kind of work in the field as clinicians or exercise professionals, I wrote a book last year, actually the book on exercise for the American Diabetes Association that's called Exercise and Diabetes. And that one is not really written for the average lay person, but it really goes through all the different types of diabetes, the different types of activities, and then a lot of the health conditions that people may be dealing with when they're trying to exercise, such as heart disease or obesity and so forth, especially when you get into more of a type 2 population. And then for anybody who really wants to lose weight, whether that person's an athlete or not, I co-authored a book that came out just this spring called The Diabetes Breakthrough, and my co-author is a physician at the Jaws on Diabetes Clinic that's associated with Harvard Medical School, and this is the book version of the program that they use. It's a 12-week program to help people with diabetes lose weight and keep it off, so that also is a very good resource. But I'm happy to answer questions, as I said, if people want to email me, or if sometimes I will direct them to one of my books and say, why don't you read the background on exercise physiology, because that'll answer a lot of your questions, and then if you have any left, email me after that.
Well, again, Dr. Colberg, I appreciate you taking some time out of your day. I'll speak on your behalf if you don't mind. I sent her one email, and Sheri fired back within minutes saying, let's do this. And getting on the show has been a very easy opportunity for me to just talk shop and bring a little bit of, hopefully, awareness to something that a lot of people are dealing with, but no one's really confronting potentially. And sometimes it's good just to step outside your comfort zone and learn more about what can help others in your program. For the coaches that have diabetic athletes or diabetic coaches or diabetic families, do me a favor and pick up one of these books. Learn more. If you want to become more, you got to reach out and put yourself out there. And we're going to open up a book, send an email, and just identify an issue that it really can become a cool way of you interacting and building a relationship with the people you get a chance to have in your life. So, Sheri, man, I really appreciate you taking some time out of your day. Hopefully this is a launching pad for us to do things down the line here, and I look forward to just keeping in touch.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure. Thank you again.